Nice to meet you. Have we ever met before?
Your face rings a bell.
When was the last time you think?
A few days ago.
Okay. So yeah, we know each other, and I just want to tell you, your book is doing very well, but my book just went to soft cover, and I made some money out of it. I'm
Nice,
right behind you.
fantastic.
You're the better sold book, but mine is the more interesting one.
That's true. Yours is much funnier too.
Okay, so so this is a big task to us to do what we're trying to do to ask should we call aging a disease? But let's start with, is aging a disease? What would be your view about it, and how would you express that?
Well, yeah, I did express it in my book, and really the theme of my book, uh, probably the leading theme, is that aging is a disease, and it's increasingly a treatable one. And this dawned on me over a decade ago when I was looking at the definition of what a disease is. And if you go to manuals on geriatrics, what it says is that a disease is a process of deterioration that causes suffering, illness, pain, and potentially death. And I thought, well, that sounds a lot like aging to me. And when I looked into it, why is aging not called a disease if it fits all those criteria? It's that less than half of the population, if they're affected by a process, that's a disease. But if it's affected by the majority, we refer to it as a natural course of life. And so we've excluded aging, unfortunately, from diseases. But to me, it doesn't matter how many people get something happening to them. In fact, if it's something that happens to a lot of people, it's even more important that we focus on it as a disease process or a medical condition, because that is what attracts research, development, innovation, and ultimately medicines.
So, just one point. You said it's something like it's increasingly treatable, but what examples do you have that aging is treatable in humans?
Well, I cite some of your work. Is a lot of retrospective work looking at certain drugs that have been given to tens of thousands of people, and in the case of metformin, millions of people. And there are increasing numbers of studies that associate taking certain molecules, metformin is one, with lower rates of frailty, cancer, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease in the elderly, which isn't proof that we can slow aging in humans yet, but it's certainly very, very strong evidence. And the evidence is backing up decades of research in animal studies, and even smaller organisms, that aging is malleable, that it can be slowed down and even reversed in more recent work. And now that we have the tools to actually measure biological age, there are many different clocks. There's a popular one called the DNA methylation or Horvath clock. We're learning as a field that some treatments and even some lifestyles are able to slow and initially and slightly reverse the aging of people, the age of people. And so we're at a turning point where I like to think of the analogy of the Wright brothers, where the world wasn't even ready for flight. They didn't even think it was possible. It was a crazy dream. And then they did it and everything changed. And we scientists and those who are innovating the medicines now are on the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk, figuring out how this works. And to me, it's not an if, it's a matter of when doctors will more regularly prescribe these kind of medicines for people, not just for diabetes in the case of metformin, but to actually slow down diseases that would come with aging.
So the Wright brothers also wrote a grant to the government to develop a airplane for commercial purposes, and the government said that they don't see any possibility that air travel
Well,
or commercial purposes will be done. But
mhm.
but I think it underlines really the timeline. Look, uh, you're right that there is a lot of evidence of drugs, but this is not wasn't a clinical study that was controlled, that gave people that are elderly those drugs and show that there's effect. So I think we don't have that. I would just say that we're totally in agreement here. I've been calling aging the mother of all diseases because I think it drives all diseases. So if we can treat the mother of all diseases, then yeah, we we should call aging a disease. But I want to stop this part now because I think we understand that we're ahead of the curve. We know that it's malleable. We know that we can target aging, we can delay, we can reverse in several instances. But let's be practical and let's talk about what happened with ICD-10 going to ICD-11, David.
Right. So the ICD codes, these are used, put out by the World Health Organization to
By the
classify.
way, I should say ICD is the International Statistical Classification of Diseases, and it's a WHO organization.
Exactly. And it's more important than just a list. It goes back over 100 years of classifying things that hurt, maim, harm, cause suffering, and kill people. And there have been debates over the years how to classify these diseases because some of them are overlapping, and some of them are not treatable, and some of them we think of just as natural and acceptable in the case of aging, unfortunately. But we thought that there was a really great opportunity when the World Health Organization revealed that in their uh, release of this ICD list, number 11, version 11, this year, that there would be a momentous change because what they inserted was old age as a medical condition, which we were excited about. Nir, you and I were super excited, the whole field, because finally we could point to something and say, you know what, this is something that goes wrong. It's something that we should work towards treating, and that doctors could feel or even get reimbursed in a positive way to be able to prescribe medicines that they believe their patients could benefit from, even if they don't have that specific age-related disease yet. And metformin's always a good example here, that if old age is a disease and you go to your doctor, then the doctor could perhaps get reimbursed even in certain countries, perhaps one day the whole world, for treating a patient before they get diabetes and also prevent other diseases as well. But it's a complex world, a complex system. And what happened was that there was some objections, and there's always pushback when something momentous changes. And this what is unfortunately what happened here. And the World Health Organization rolled it back so that it doesn't say old age anymore. It's something more watered down, pathological processes that lead to the loss of an organism's progress at older ages and frailty. So this is not old age. It's a step forward, but not as large as we were hoping.
So I just want to make sure that you understand. So the ICD-11, the ICD is International Statistical Classification of Diseases, okay, but it doesn't stop here, and related health problems. And so the old age was in the related health programs that have another diagnosis category that's called MG2A for symptoms and signs of clinical finding. And a lot of people are saying it was never meant to be a disease. It was meant for other things. In fact, I learned that the major driver to changes was not us, the biologists, that said it should be a disease because we can treat it. It's because in the last version, instead, there wasn't aging, but there was a senile condition, and people, elderly, got insulted because what do you mean senile? We're not senile. And they had to find another term. And the combination of taking senile away and maybe having a biology of aging caused it to happen. So tell me, what the people who are against, the people who reversed it, what was their arguments?
Well, first of all, let me tell you, Brazil was a major force behind this. There was a national, regional campaign. It was online. It was called "Old Age is Not a Disease," and it raised that up into a national debate. And then MDs contacted and met with the World Health Organization, and I think made a strong case, at least one that led to this change. In my view, unfortunately, and I wrote about this in an article in the Lancet, along with some of my esteemed colleagues. And so you can check that out. That's online. And really, one of the big pushbacks, I think, was practical. The thought that you could classify old age as a disease might lead to doctors using old age as a cause of death on the death certificate, which would then perhaps prevent the identification of the specific cause of death. But that's not what it was designed for, as you spoke. But unfortunately, yeah, it was seen as a threat to that, and they won their case.
Right. They said that if everybody above 60, you'll say old age, you don't have to say they died from COVID, they died from this and that was a practical objection. But I find that the major leaders, and by the way, the antagonism was led by several sectors, non-government, professional organization, civil society organization, national, regional, international level. There is a lot, and I find that the major thing was ageism. A lot of the people who are even funded, a lot of the GSA members on the social science, psychological science have fought ageism for a long time. And for them, calling aging a disease was the worst thing you could do. And in fact, they were supported by the elderly. The elderly don't want to be called sick. Because you know what happened with COVID? We isolated it. We sent them into islands, into prison, and they were suffering miserably. So they don't want to be called sick, and not everybody who's over age of 60 is sick. The AARP doesn't want to call aging a disease. American Federation of Aging Research, we're both on the board, David. They don't want to call aging a disease. The FDA doesn't want to call aging a disease, although they agreed with the tame terms. Um, so all of a sudden, we found ourselves with with the people we want, the people we wanted to help are the most antagonistic.
For sure. I like to use the analogy of obesity. Okay, that there was a major change around a decade ago, as I recall, where obesity was declared by the FDA as a disease, or at least a treatable medical condition. And Nir, you might recall more than I do. But this was a major change. It was something that now could be treatable. And now, if you fast forward to today, what we have are really great and increasingly effective and safe treatments for obesity, and also type 2 diabetes, which of course goes hand in hand with obesity. And I think that's largely driven by obesity being a treatable medical condition. The same would happen for aging. This is why we want it to change. We don't care about the words, we care about the practical implications of defining something as treatable. Okay. And the same thing would happen, is that there would be more investment and more inclination of even insurance companies to look into aging as something that is preventable. And that will actually save billions of dollars. My colleagues and I have published that just saving 1 year of human life in a healthy way, extending life in the US, could save $86 trillion in the long run, just in the US. So these words mean things. They make a big difference to the future of the planet. And I don't think these decisions about codes should be based on psychology and people who get offended. Yeah, it's a word, get over it. I think it's more important that we develop medicines to treat not just that generation, but future generations. People who are now in their 20s and 30s could easily miss out on medicines that will never be made because of this change.
Well, you went already to should we call aging a disease, but let me just make a point, because again, I want to go back to our clients, okay? And I'm not buying it that we don't care who's antagonistic. We should do that, and I'll give you some example. But look, I'm in diabetes clinic. Most of the diabetic patients are obese, and I used to write obesity is one of the problem. Now the patients get to see the medical record, okay? And now our administration told us you cannot write obesity because obesity is insulting. And we said, okay, just to show you the sensitivity of the patient. So what do I have to write? Write that they have BMI of 36. Okay. So now I'm not writing obesity, I'm writing BMI of 36. Now you get reimbursed from the medical problems. And now we put obesity as part of the charge of the treatment, and the insurance said, "I'm sorry, you didn't write obesity. We're not going to give it back to you." A whole deal of issue because of patient sensitivity. I'm just saying, I think we have and that's what we should discuss, how we get the elderly to understand that we are for them. But I want to go and talk about this YouTube that was done by the GSA. And I'll tell you, our representative there couldn't be better, Matt Kaberlein. Okay, there are four people in the panel, and Matt Kaberlein was the biology of aging. Matt Kaberlein is top 5 people in our marketing efforts. And he actually did a really good job, but he was swallowed by the emotions of everybody else in the panel. One of the panelists was Jack Rowe. Okay, Jack Rowe is very well known. He's a geriatrician. He ran Athena company, very respected guy. And his problem is that he was said, "I'm afraid from anti-aging winning in a bad way and legitimizing life extension efforts." He didn't say about the legitimate way, he didn't talk about geroscience, but he and other put everything under anti-aging, and that all that it's going to do is a lot of anti-aging, a lot of confusion, a lot of benefactory, but not the elderly themselves. But then there were other who were talking about not about attitudes and beliefs that you do not want to change, that disease that are treatable will not be managed because you will call them older, that the triage of there'll be a triage resources by age. Anti-aging will thrive and power. You move back, I'm just quoting, from goals to alternative medicine. There is a lot of anger, and certainly no recognition. Even though Matt says, "Hey, we're doing things," and he was talking about it, there it's like ignored. Another thing that was really striking is the fact that everybody said aging is a natural thing. Okay, yeah, COVID is a natural thing. Global warming is a natural thing. I think this is maybe where we can come in and kind of explain better that, yeah, we naturally age, but do we need to? And that hasn't been done.
Yeah.
David.
Oh, I hope you don't mean global warming is 100% a natural thing.
No, but right, but the cycles, right, but the cycles are
It,
also natural.
and
Yeah.
it's a decent analogy because there is climate change, of course, but we can make it worse. And the same is true for aging. We all age naturally, but we also can accelerate and decelerate the rate that we age now. That's very clear from a lot of different studies by how we live our life and increasingly how doctors treat us. The important thing about all of this is that just because something's natural doesn't mean it's acceptable. That's not an argument. It never has been. What about your surroundings? Any of you watching or listening is natural. I don't see anything in this room. Maybe the wood table was once natural, but everything else is artificial. We've made a world for ourselves and we cannot exist in the wild, and we don't accept the way the world treats us naturally. We heat our houses, we cure diseases. Aging is just the same. There is no shame in trying to make people healthier for longer. In fact, it's what we do in medicine. That is the goal. So I'm at a loss why there's such resistance to really what doctors are aiming to do, which is to keep their patients healthier for longer. It's just that we're tackling what we believe to be the root cause of most of those problems that happen in old age. Alzheimer's, for instance, in my lab, we've got research that says that 80 to 90% of that disease is aging itself. And when we reverse the age of an animal's brain, memory comes back. So we're tackling disease at the end of life and putting band-aids on something and forgetting about what's largely driving that process from the beginning.
But David, you're talking from the point of view that, if we were all mice, we had it all set, right? We know what to do. I think you're jumping the gun because you're very optimistic and I'm very optimistic because the things that we see in our labs, right? The thing with the gather. But the situation should be, and I think we're all convinced here, we're a very biased crowd. But the question for us now, and I think we should open it to everyone, is should we call aging a disease? Should we call it now? Is it yes, but not yet? Because it's a political look, what you say, everything you said is right, but people who scientists who are listening to that, okay, to Matt Kaberlein, they're just not hearing that. So we have to make a decision. What are we going to do now? Do we have the concept that yeah, aging drives diseases, but do we call it disease now before we have any real good proof that we can modulate that? And I'm saying proof that's accepted by FDA, not accepted by us. Okay, not association, but are there good study that shows that are acceptable to everyone? And how do we tackle this process of convincing people that's not natural what we're doing? It's absolutely
I think it's potentially a problem to call. I mean, I think there's sorry, this is Joe. You can maybe I'll turn on my video. There is like people get hung up on words and like, what is a disease? But I'm wondering if there's some other way that we could project. Like one of the problems that I've heard as a theme come up for you guys is that we end up getting kind of marginalized or radicalized as like the longevity people or whatever. And some of our task is to be able to like be taken more seriously. And so what are some things that have done really well? Like aging to me is, a bunch of horrible stuff going on in our cells. They're getting more and more compromised by all this, various things that are invisible for a while, but then end up causing lots of problems. Things that have done fantastic are, for instance, blood pressure. Like I can live my life and do everything just fine if I have a higher blood pressure than normal. I can still run, I can hang out with my friends, I can think, but if my blood pressure is too high, I have a higher chance of having a heart attack or stroke and like all this other stuff. So, but I don't know if people call it specifically a disease, but it's for sure like a treatable thing. It's like an endpoint that everybody takes as a proxy for disease.
So Joe,
is there a different word we could use besides disease?
Those two are good points, and I'll make one specific on hypertension. Hypertension was known as a risk factor for strokes, for cardiovascular disease, and the FDA approved blood pressure only after clinical trials have shown that it reduces all those diseases. Okay, yeah. And that's where we are. That was my point. We haven't had a study there. We have all those association stuff, but we haven't had a study that really showed that we're taking cluster of disease and moving them because we gave some treatment. The second thing that you said, could we ask something else? So David and I had this trial in Twitter. We said, can you find some other definition to old age or aging? And as far as I know, we got 0 suggestions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like maybe it's like too radicalizing to try to pull all the different types of aging, degeneration, damage, whatever you want to call it, changes, shifts in the things that compromise our homeostasis, capacity, etc., under one thing. Like maybe that's what's radicalizing about it. Like maybe we should pick our favorite top 5 or something, because we have like blood pressure and hypercholesterolemia. There's a bunch of other things that have become kind of risen up and become like, oh, dude, I'm sorry, you have high cholesterol. Yeah, you should deal with that. But they're individual things. should we pick like, like accumulation of misfolded proteins or like epigenetic drift, increased histological entropy, or like, are there some that are like iconic enough that we could focus on those and they would be much more like a very specific thing that's hard to attack as a straw man because of its associations to radicalized concepts?
Anybody else wants to comment? I just want to tell you, in the LBA we had this discussion. We're kind of supporting the concept that there are hallmarks of aging without prioritizing them,
Mm-hmm.
because from investment perspective, investors want to find a hallmark that they will tackle and just watch, because if it's really a gerotherapeutics, there's more indication that can come out of that. So we don't want to lose, we don't want to be more specific than we are from that perspective. Alex, you wrote about this thing. Again, the question is, should we call aging a disease now, considering the opposition? I should also just remind you, the FDA is looking for tame. At the end, I'm satisfied with what they'll give, what it will be for, and we'll call it aging, and they don't have to call it aging. Okay, they still think that maybe metformin does 9 different things by accident. Okay, but should we call aging a disease now, or should the LBA call it?
So, Nir, good question. I think that there are three angles to answer this question. So from the FDA pathway and the investment pathway and the company credibility pathway, I think that it really doesn't matter how you call it, as long as your therapeutic pipeline is targeting both an age-associated disease or even non-age-associated disease, and a fundamental pathway implicated in aging, or preferably driving aging, implicated in one or more of the hallmarks. So in that case, you would be fundamentally solving the aging problem, but at the same time, you will have a very clear-cut pathway towards developing a credible therapeutic that, round B, round D, round C, investors would support, because they would want to see a reimbursable therapeutic within the classical disease focused framework. So for biotech company formation, it really doesn't matter. For us internally, I think it's very important to recognize aging as a disease, because it's part of our mission to address aging and target aging at the most fundamental level. And as purists, we need to, answer this question to ourselves. Should we call it a disease? I would always call it a disease, right? And of course, maybe we need to start with that to be able to set the groundwork and framework for the others to perceive it as a disease. And third, the way we use artificial intelligence to track aging is that for AI purposes, for building AI-based aging clocks, we use age as a stage of a disease. So we train deep neural networks to predict your chronological age in a healthy state, right? And for that framework, you would need to use it as a disease and call it a disease. Then imagine that you use 2 neurons on the output of a deep neural network, age and disease status, and then you can find dual purpose therapeutics that are implicated in aging and disease at the same time. But usually it will be very similar approach to how to classify disease and aging within the framework of a deep neural network. So from the perspective of something that is tracking longitudinal data over time, I would still call aging as a disease, because ultimately it leads to loss of function and death, which is usually a result of a disease as well.
Thank you. That was a good discussion. Felipe?
Well, I'm on the fencing here, so I understand all the reasons why we should call it a disease, and they're all practical reasons. And I've heard the discussion, very good, both of you, especially David, very good responses to the questions from Nir. My concern is that, do we really need to? Considering that, and it was mentioned, like drugs that prevent future cardiovascular disease are approved by the FDA. Basically, hypercholesterolemia, as was mentioned, is considered a risk factor, really. Hypercholesterolemia is not a disease, it doesn't have symptoms, it's a risk factor. And yet, as Nir said, once we have clear clinical data suggesting that we can attack aging, then it could be accepted by the FDA and the European Commission and everything as a risk factor. And that's what it is. I understand what David said at the beginning. Yes, it has all the characteristics of aging, of a disease. However, it is important, I think, the fact that if it happens to more than 50%, it's not a disease. It's an argument that often used against the Alzheimer's Association, which said 80% of people get Alzheimer's. No, they don't. If 80% of people get Alzheimer's, then it's not a disease, right? And the argument that everybody puts, I mean, is menopause a disease? Is menarche a disease? Those are important considerations in whether or not we call it a disease. I think that's the jury is still out, and I think that we need to take, as Joe said, maybe slow steps. I've been arguing that the main characteristic of aging is loss of resilience, and maybe we can convince the FDA to treat the loss of resilience, or I don't know if that would be even more possible. But so that's why I'm in defense on this.
Aaron, Weaver, or Stefan, do you have anything you want to share? What we heard actually quite interesting additions after David and mine. If you have,
Yes, I mean, I can just throw a few words in. I think one thing I've never done is I've never gone back historically and seen the path of how things have achieved their ICD codes. Because I know that I think it's correct that sarcopenia only got the code in 2016, and it's folks at Novartis and others pushing their stuff through the clinic, which then provides the impetus to, I guess they're also lobbying like crazy, but can we learn from how things have achieved ICD status and think about a strategy that tries to line up our aging indications with aging itself at the far end of that process?
So for me, it's setting us for failure. If sarcopenia and frailty that are so end stage things in aging, if we need to reverse that, I think it's much more hard than to stop aging. Okay, so I think those things, I don't like those things because we haven't had success. I mean, there are some studies there that are better, but when you look at the studies that are not people from sarcopenia, it's all kind of a prevention. And prevention is good, but I think sarcopenia and frailty are also setting us for a failure. I rather have aging as a disease as a risk, and not sarcopenia or frailty as a disease, personally. James, can you wrap up what you heard?
Sure, happy to. As you know, Nir, summarizing is my favorite game in the world, because it's been really interesting to listen to this conversation, I think, because, the question that we posed at the beginning with the conversation between the two of you, David and Nir, it's a very adversarial one, right? It feels like a binary outcome. Should aging be a disease or should it not be a disease? Like, fight. And it's pretty clear, I think, from this conversation that this is not a, it's not like there's a line down the middle of the aging research world with one camp on one side viciously opposing another camp on the other side. This is an argument where really almost everyone in the field is on the same side, right? And we heard, I think, well articulated from Alex, that we're all on board with the idea that from the perspective of the mission of this field, that we think aging is treatable and that new interventions, new therapeutics will be able to intervene in a person's biology before they get sick to prevent the diseases of aging. And whether the mechanism by which we do that calls aging a disease or a risk condition, or we run clinical trials that just leave all of that out and just say we are preventing Alzheimer's and cancer and heart disease at the same time, that is a tactic to achieve the same strategy. And I think that's kind of what I'm taking away from this discussion, is that the tactics for how we go from where we are today to get to that point where we're using these new tools to address the underlying mechanisms that cause aging, those are quite varied, and different groups are going to take different tactics, but the strategy seems very aligned across all of the leaders and organizations that I've heard from today.
That's great, and I have probably an idea, but Nicola, you wrote something in the chat. Can you repeat what you felt? I think it was kind of right on. We can't hear you.
Apologies. It was just in response to the comment you made when you said some of the feedback that you were getting from different people. And I think understanding that stakeholder landscape is probably an interesting starting point as well, because, for example, reframing how we communicate the language of aging might be enough to satisfy, say, the general population or the older population, but not necessarily to satisfy the doctors who may have a completely different problem with this concept and idea of aging. And I thought in particular, your point that you mentioned about some doctors were worried that if aging was framed as a disease, it would result in reduced treatment of patients because you may not be identifying the specific conditions they have. I just thought was a really interesting point because, one of the main kind of missions and goals of longevity biotech companies is to expand and increase the arsenal of treatments that you have available for patients who are at risk of these diseases and of an older age. So I thought that was just just when you mentioned it, it just made me think that's quite an interesting disconnect between what people are perceiving and what we're actually trying to do. So it was just something that really kind of struck me, I guess. I don't have a solution, but I thought it was an interesting point.
Well, I think practically, and as you said, there's a practical, we have to have a practical way to deal with it, and respectable way to deal with it, and we don't want to insult people, but I think probably the best way for us is to kind of take James' summary and our discussion and do a white paper in order to say, this is how we look at those things, and those are the obstacles, and that's what we're hoping to achieve. And at the end, whether aging is formally a disease or not, we're going to make a progress no way more. But I think by writing a paper that we said, look, we have several ways and to think about it is really helpful, because we can point to this paper as saying we recognize the difficulties and how it might view our mission. James, you agree?
I'm always happy to put more arguments conveying unity across our field out into the world. I think, for when this goes up on YouTube or wherever, we internally across the roundtable shared a number of publications and documents where David and Alex and others have already written some perspectives about this. I think, it's to be determined whether we as a group think that we have additional comments and voice that would be added in, but we should definitely link all of those commentary that members of this group have already made. underneath that video. So, this is that spot where I think YouTubers say, so look below in the comments for whatever, for those links. But yeah, I think this was exactly the conversation that many people outside the field are having. But interestingly, it's not as big of a conversation within the field. And I think that's the most important message to send to folks who are not in this roundtable, not directly part of this conversation, but instead part of the group of people watching the field develop from the outside, to have them know that whether aging is considered a disease with these ICD-11 codes, whether it's not, it doesn't derail the train of progress that's being made in this space. I think the notion that there's A, not a schism in the field, and B, this ICD-11 ruling doesn't change really any of the plans for how us in running biotech companies developing drugs in this space, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're an academic group doing clinical trials, whomever, doesn't change a lick about what's going on as far as progressing the science forward in this field. And I think that's the core message around this particular discussion.
David, you have the final rights here. I can't hear you. Mute.
I think this has been a great discussion. It's really been, we covered all the major topics. I think that what James said in a summary, which is super important, is that we don't disagree. And really it just comes down to what's the best practical approach to help people on the planet. This is why we do this. This is all about helping billions of people on the planet live longer, healthier lives. And I think if we frame the question differently, instead of saying, how many of you would like to live to 120? A lot of people are nervous about that because they picture being old and frail. Instead, if you ask the question, how many of you would like to have an extra 2 years with your parents in a healthy state, or not suffer in the last 5 years of life and be vibrant and productive and look after your grandkids? That's very different. I think most people would say, yeah, give me that. And it's the same questions, just asked differently. And really what we're talking about here is finding a practical way to help more people. We don't have a big disagreement across the planet about what the final goal is. I thought we should also mention, for those who are not in the field, that the science has come to a point where we do understand many of the underlying causes of aging, and we even have ways to measure it very accurately, surprisingly accurately, and there are a number of what we call biological clocks. And to Joe's point earlier about what could we do about this, looking at blood pressure and cholesterol as guides, these clocks could one day be very useful measures that doctors could use to look at the future trajectory and health of their patients, to act well before any symptoms arise. And that's the bright future that I hope that we as a group can inspire others to join in on the cause and get to that future that I think should be here as soon as possible.
And talking about this future, we just launched the Healthy Longevity Medicine Society to start already educating doctors, longevity doctors, on the other hand, informing them what's going on, what's clinical trials, what's not, what's available, how to give, etc. So that the wave is totally increasing, and I'm sure we'll be successful. So with that, I think I thank you. I thank you, everyone, and we'll decide how we proceed with spreading the gospels here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nir, for hosting.
Okay, Risa.
Likewise, great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Well
Bye-bye.
done, everyone.
Okay,
That's
guys.
great.